The suit alarm was already screaming when my eyes opened, and the first thing I understood was that my right leg would not move. Ice had closed over the crack in the ground within seconds, and I was on the wrong side of it, half buried, my thermal regulator flashing a dead red light against my wrist. Above me, through a haze of blowing snow, I could see three shapes standing at the edge of the fracture, tall and narrow, their skin catching the weak light in a dull orange shimmer. Vikrathi, my crewmates, or what was left of that word, now that the ground had opened up and decided I belonged to it. Owen, do you hear me? The voice in my ear belonged to Threll, the expedition lead, sharp with something that was not quite panic but was standing very close to it. Your suit reads a hull breach. Can you move? Legs stuck, I said. My breath fogged inside my visor faster than the heater could clear it. Cold's coming in fast. I want to explain something before the rest of this happens, because it matters. I was the only human on Charn 9, a moon made of ice sheets and silence, sent along with a Vikrathi survey team as part of a program neither of our governments fully trusted yet. The idea was simple on paper: put a human and 3 Vikrathi on a frozen rock for 2 weeks, let them run geological samples together, and see if 2 species that used to point weapons at each other could learn to share a thermos instead. Charn 9 had other plans. A pressure fault under the ice sheet had been building for longer than anyone predicted, and on day 6 it finally gave. Our transport dropped through first. I was thrown clear by the blast of escaping gas beneath the ice, which was the only reason I was still breathing at all instead of buried under several tons of frozen hull. My suit had not been so lucky. The regulator that kept my body warm in an environment that sat somewhere around minus 140 degrees Celsius on the night side had taken a hit, and it was dying by the second. The cache with spare heating cells is 11 minutes from your position, Threll said. Behind her voice I could hear Vess and Kale arguing in short, clipped bursts of their own language. We are calculating. I already knew what they would calculate, because I had read the same manuals they had, and I had also read a few they had not. Vikrathi biology runs hot. Their resting body temperature sits nearly 15 degrees above mine, and their species evolved on a volcanic world where cold has only ever meant one thing to them: the end. It is not something they choose to believe. It is wired into every nerve they have, the same way a human flinches from fire without needing to think about it first. When a Vikrathi sees a body go still, and its temperature fall past a certain point, some very old part of their mind simply closes the file and writes the word finished across it. 11 minutes will not be enough, Threll said, and her voice had gone very quiet. Owen, I am sorry. Your core temperature is already falling faster than the model predicted. I know, I said. And then I did the only thing I had left, which was the thing my training had spent years turning into something closer to instinct than choice. I stopped fighting the cold and instead started working with it. Human bodies are strange machines, built by nothing more organized than accident and pressure, and one of the strangest things about them is how much slower they can be made to run, given the right push. Free divers can hold their pulse down through nothing but focus. Soldiers training in the coldest places on our planet learn to fold their own bodies into something close to hibernation, breath by breath, until their skin reads barely warmer than the air around them and their heart beats once every several seconds instead of once every one. It is not magic. It is old, hard-earned knowledge about what a human body can survive if you stop panicking and start managing it like a system instead of a person. I folded my arms against my chest, forced my breathing long and shallow, and began chasing my own heartbeat downward the way I had been taught, syllable by syllable, until the alarm in my ear seemed to come from somewhere very far away. The last thing I heard clearly before the world went soft at the edges was Threll's voice, no longer speaking to me, but to Vess and Kale, in a tone I recognized even through a language I barely understood. It was the tone of someone confirming a decision nobody wanted to make.
He has stopped responding,
she said. His signature reads as terminal. We cannot save him and reach shelter ourselves. We must retreat. I could have argued. I could not. My jaw no longer answered when I asked it to. I felt hands, too hot against the outside of my suit, checking for something they did not find. I felt myself being laid back against the broken hull instead of carried toward it, and then I felt nothing at all except the wind, because the 3 of them turned and walked away from me into the storm, leaving me exactly where I had fallen, in a drift of snow already climbing past my knees. I do not think less of them for it. Their instincts are not wrong most of the time. A body that cold, that still, on their world would already be gone. They were simply wrong about me, and there was no way for them to know that yet, because nobody had ever given them a reason to doubt what cold meant. There was a small, stubborn human part of me, buried somewhere under the slowed pulse and the fog closing over my thoughts, that noticed something else too. It noticed that for 6 days, All three of them had talked about my species the way you talk about something interesting but fragile, something that needed to be managed carefully because it might break. And some old quiet part of me thought, with whatever was left of my sense of humor, good, now you get to find out. I had perhaps 6 hours before the cold I had chosen to survive turned into the cold that actually ends things. I spent the first 2 of them doing nothing at all except holding still, letting my body find its lowest safe point and settle there, the way a diver holds at the bottom of a breath instead of fighting back to the surface too early. My mind drifted, the way it does when the body slows down enough to stop demanding all of its attention. I thought about Laura, back at the relay station in orbit, who had told me before I went down to the surface that she thought this whole mission was a mistake dressed up as diplomacy. I thought about my training instructor, a quiet man named Peter, who used to say that the cold does not care what you deserve, only what you know. I thought about nothing at all for long stretches, which was its own kind of relief. Somewhere around the 3rd hour, the storm that had been building all day since we landed finally broke loose. Charn 9's wind does not build slowly. It arrives all at once, tearing sideways across the ice sheet at speeds that would flatten a person standing upright, driving snow so thick that the horizon simply stopped existing. And that was when my suit began to scream. It was not a scream in any way that a person would recognize at first, not a voice, not a word. It was a rising, wailing tone, cycling up and down with the gusts of wind, carried through the storm in a way that made it sound almost alive. This was not something the Vikrathi had built into their own equipment, because they had never needed it. It was a feature written into human suits a long time ago, after enough near misses in enough cold places, by someone who understood a simple and stubborn truth. Sometimes rescuers give up too early, and sometimes the person they gave up on is still there. The siren was built to trigger the moment a suit detected 2 things together, a body reading as near death, and a sudden shift in nearby shelter pressure, the exact signature of someone being left behind by people who believed there was nothing left to save. It did not whisper. It was built to argue, loudly, with anyone who had already decided to stop looking. The wind caught that long wailing tone and bent it, threw it 3 kilometers across open ice, and pushed it straight into the shelter dome where Threll, Vess, and Kale had sealed themselves against the storm. Threll told me afterward, once we were both able to talk about it without either of us needing to look away, that all 3 of them froze in place the moment they heard it. It rose out of the whiteout in long, climbing waves, fading and returning with every gust, and for several long minutes none of them said a word, because every instinct they carried told them the same impossible thing. It sounded like grief given a voice. It sounded like the ice itself objecting to what had just been done on top of it. We believed the moon was answering us, Threll admitted later. We believed Charn 9 had heard what we did, and was screaming it back. Vess wanted to seal the dome tighter and wait out the storm. Kale agreed with her, arguing that whatever was making that sound out in the dark was not something living, and going back out into a storm like that one chasing a noise would only cost them 2 more lives instead of preventing the loss of 1. Their instincts were not cowardice. They were simply built for a world where cold only ever meant an ending, and where nothing that sounded like that had ever once turned out to be a mistake worth correcting. It was Threll who stood in the doorway of that shelter and made herself listen past what her instincts were telling her. "We do not actually know what humans are," she said. "We have watched Owen for 6 days and assumed his limits matched ours, because that is the only measure we have ever had. What if we are wrong about this too?" I was not there to hear the argument that followed, only the shape of it afterward, told to me in pieces. Kale refused at first. Vess hesitated. But Threll pointed out something simple and hard to argue with. If there was even a small chance the sound meant I was not gone, then walking away from it meant choosing certainty over the small effort of checking. And a species that prided itself on caution, she said, owed itself at least that much caution before it decided a life was finished. They came back into the storm at just past the 4th hour. I do not remember most of what happened when they reached me, because by then my mind had gone somewhere quiet and slow, somewhere close to sleep but not quite sleep. I remember pieces. I remember a hand, far too warm against the side of my neck, holding there longer than made sense if the answer had truly been nothing. I remember Threll's voice, close now instead of distant, saying my name over and over, not as a question this time, but as an instruction, the way you speak to someone you are trying to pull back up out of deep water. My pulse when she found it was there, slow beyond anything her instruments had a normal reading for, slower than anything her instincts told her should still count as alive, but there, steady, refusing the label she had already given it hours earlier. What followed was 20 frantic minutes that I only know secondhand, because my jaw would barely move, and my thoughts were coming to me in fragments, delayed, as if arriving from somewhere far away. Kale worked the portable heater with hands that were shaking. Vess held my head steady and kept repeating something in her own language that Threll later told me was closer to a prayer than a medical instruction. Threll herself followed the scraps of guidance I managed to force out through a mouth that had mostly stopped listening to me, warming my core slowly instead of quickly, because a body brought back too fast from that kind of cold can suffer worse than one brought back with patience. I woke up 6 hours later inside the shelter dome, wrapped in 3 layers of insulation that were not designed for a human body but had been improvised anyway, and found all 3 of them sitting in a loose half circle around where I lay, not speaking, simply watching me the way you watch something you have decided you do not understand yet, and very much want to. Your kind, Threll said slowly, once she saw my eyes open, does not always die when it appears to be dying. No, I said. My voice came out rough, like something dragged over gravel. We're stubborn that way. Nobody laughed. I think all 3 of them were still deciding whether that had been a joke or a fact, and on Charn 9 that day, it was honestly a little of both. We finished the survey together after that, though the mood of the mission had shifted into something quieter and more careful than it had been in the first 6 days. Nobody said much about what had happened out on the ice, not directly, but I noticed small things. Vess started checking on me before every shift outside, without being asked. Kale stopped referring to human biology as fragile in his notes and started using the word unpredictable instead, which I took as a kind of compliment. Threll asked me question after question in the evenings, about training, about the body, about how a species that runs so much colder than hers had ever learned to survive worlds that seemed built to kill it. I did not have perfect answers for her. I told her what I knew, which was that humans did not evolve anywhere close to the cold, that we came from warm plains and open grassland, and that everything we later learned about surviving ice and snow and vacuum had been earned the hard way, through mistakes, through loss, through people who refused to accept an ending until they had tested it themselves. I told her about divers who had stopped their own hearts on purpose to prove it could be survived, and about the long, slow decades of learning that followed, decade after decade of people insisting that the first answer was never the last one. She listened to all of it with the particular stillness that Vicrothi use when they are turning something over carefully in their minds. The final report we filed together did not spend much time on the details of what had happened to me personally. It focused, as reports do, on soil samples and pressure readings and the geology of a moon that had nearly killed one of its visitors without meaning anything by it at all. But somewhere in the appendix, in a section Threll insisted on writing herself, there was a short paragraph about human physiological response to extreme cold, and about the possibility that other assumptions built into Vicrothi's survey protocol might need to be reconsidered when working alongside a species so different from their own. That paragraph traveled further than any of us expected. It passed up through several levels of Vicrothi command, and eventually someone with enough authority to matter asked the question that everyone involved had clearly been avoiding out loud. If a human being could go that cold, that still, and still come back from it, what other limits had been assumed rather than tested? What else might we be capable of surviving that looked, from the outside, exactly like an ending? I do not have a clean answer to that question, and I am not sure anyone does yet, human or otherwise. I think that might be the entire point of it. We are a species that keeps testing the edges of what is supposed to be possible, not because we are certain we will succeed, but because giving up before checking has never once felt like the right way to find out. What I do know is this. On a frozen moon far from anywhere either of our people call home, 3 people who had already grieved for me stood inside a sealed shelter and heard the snow outside begin to scream, and for a few long minutes, some very old part of them believed the ice itself was answering back. It was not the moon. It was not a ghost. It was only a machine, built a long time ago by someone who understood something simple about my species and refused to let it be forgotten, that we do not always go quietly, and that anyone who assumes we have should probably check twice before they walk away. We just have a strange habit, every now and then, of sounding like we already have,